Again, in the eyes of those who believe in government, there is a world of difference between acceptable individual behavior and acceptable government behavior. When an individual steals $100, it is seen as an immoral crime. But when those in government steal trillions of dollars every year, it is seen as acceptable. If the average individual prints his own $100 bill, goes out and spends it, he is seen as a fraud and as a counterfeit, an immoral act akin to theft. When government gives legal permission for the Federal Reserve to do the same thing, but with trillions of fiat out of thin air dollars, then it is seen as acceptable, even useful, and necessary, while various governments have declared that the average man is not allowed to possess firearms. The mercenaries of government are allowed to have guns, bombs, fighter jets, tanks, missiles, even nuclear warheads. Ironically, such weapons, with the exception of nuclear weapons, are routinely put into the hands of the very same people who, before they became mercenaries of the state, were prohibited from possessing firearms. In other words, when those individuals use their own judgment, some politicians declare them to be untrustworthy and a danger to society, to be trusted with a 5-shot revolver. But when the same people are blindly following orders, obeying the chain of command, those same politicians declare that they can be trusted to have assault rifles, sniper rifles, grenades, mounted machine guns, tanks, fighter jets, bombers, heavy artillery, and countless other tools of large-scale destruction. In addition to the huge chasm between what the masses perceive to be acceptable individual behavior and accepted government behavior, the public sense of when government has gone too far seems almost random. The standards by which average individuals are judged are simple and constant. If they steal, defraud, assault, or murder, that is bad. But the measure of right and wrong for government seems largely arbitrary. For example, it is now widely accepted that outlawing alcohol would be unjustified, but outlawing marijuana and using widespread, constant violence to enforce the prohibition is legitimate. As an even more bizarre contradiction, most people would be rightfully offended if government attempted to coerce everyone into picking up litter in his own neighborhood, but almost accepted as legitimate when government, via the military draft, coerces people into going into another country to kill people or even die. Bizarrely, this most heinous example of forced labor, forcing people to go halfway around the world to murder complete strangers, was even committed by a government whose own rules, i.e. the 13th Amendment, prohibited involuntary servitude. It is clear that the limits of what government is allowed to do, as far as the general public is concerned, are not based on any principles whatsoever. One reason people throughout the world and throughout history have been so slow to resist tyranny is that as long as the growth of tyranny is slow and steady, the tyrants are never seen as having crossed the line. This is because without any underlying principles by which to gauge right and wrong, there can be no line to cross. The belief in authority is completely incompatible with any moral principles, precisely because the essence of the belief is the idea that those in authority are not bound by the same rules of conduct as their subjects. Logically, how could the subjects ever feel justified in dictating standards of behavior to their masters? And if taxation, forced confiscation of wealth, increased from 62% to 63%, how could any statist on principle declare that any line has been crossed or that any government has overstepped its bounds? There can be no principled objection to robbery unless it is an objection against any level of robbery, even if legal. If 1% forced confiscation of wealth by government is a legitimate principle, then so is 99%. Either the rulers own the people and have the right to take as much as they please, or the people own themselves, and the rulers have no right to forcibly take anything from them. There can be no principle anywhere in between. How could there be? What possible rational basis could there be for holding a belief that 46% of slavery is good, but 47% slavery is bad? How could there be any principled line anywhere in between 0% and 100%? When the violence of government becomes too widespread, too arbitrary, and too vicious, statists very slowly begin to question it. But there are no real principles guiding how they judge the righteousness of the actions of the ruling class. Once it is accepted that one group of people has the inherent right to commit acts of aggression against others, there is no objective standard for limiting such a right. If government can require people to have a license to drive to the corner store, why can it not require people to have a license to walk down the street? If it is legitimate for lawmakers to demand that private firearms be registered and regulated, why is it not also legitimate for them to demand that all forms of speech and expression be registered and regulated? If it's okay for politicians to create and enforce government monopoly on delivering letters, as the U.S. Postal Service has, why is it not okay for them to create and enforce government monopoly on telephone services? The reason government is always a slippery slope, constantly pushing away from freedom toward totalitarianism, is that once someone accepts the premise of a ruling class, there is no objective basis whatsoever for applying any limits to the powers of that ruling class. There can be no rational moral standard for saying that a certain person has the right to commit acts of aggression, theft, intimidation, assault, and coercion, but that he may commit such acts only to a certain degree or only if necessary. For slaves to concede that they are the rightful property of someone else, only to then claim that there are limits to what their owners may do to them, is a logical contradiction. For a subject to accept any master, including one called government, and then imagine that he, the subject, will decide the extent of the master's powers defies logic and reality. Yet that is what all believers in representative government seek to do. In short, those who believe in authority have accepted, on the most fundamental level, that they are owned by someone else. The people claiming to be authority, having accepted that idea, they then proceed to beg their masters for favors. In doing so, however, the people are continually reinforcing the idea that ultimately it is up to the masters what will be done with the subjects. The one constant message that echoes throughout the entire political process is this: here are things that we the people ask that you, the rulers, allow us to do. The implicit message underlying all political action is that the only power the people have is the power to whine and beg, and that ultimately is always up to the masters what will happen. To push for any change in the law is to accept that the law is legitimate. In contrast, if an armed driver was accosted by a carjacker with a knife, the driver would feel no need to lobby the aggressor, to beg him to give his permission for the driver to keep his own car. If the driver had the means to forcibly repel the attacker, he would have every right to do so. To ask for something is to accept that the decision is the other person's to make. To ask those in government for a bit more freedom is to admit that it is up to them whether the people may be free or not. In other words, to ask for freedom is to not be free, but to accept one's subjugation to someone else. Consider what an oxymoron it is for a person to claim to have an unalienable right to do something and then ask the politicians for their legislative permission to do that thing. The belief in authority ultimately leads even those who imagine themselves to be adherent pro-freedom advocates to condone their own subjugation. No matter how loudly they demand the politicians change some law, those who claim to love freedom while still suffering from the authority superstition merely reinforce the legitimacy of the ruling class's control over them by implicitly agreeing that the people need the ruling class's legislative permission in order to have the right to do anything.